Okay, we are now on code challenge number 41. So this is where it gets a little bit fun and really the learning challenge continues. Why this time we are going to learn about looping structures. This is another control structure in coding. This allows you to do something more than once. And this is very fundamental in terms of be able to create more complex code that does more stuff. Right now, we've looked at doing some basic math operations and then drawing comparisons with if else. And now we want to iterate. So this is what we call iteration, looping, or repetition. And our challenge number 41 says repeat a loop 10 times. So that's going to be the focal point. We're going to count by ones, which means just as it says, our loop structure will go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and so forth, and it will loop through whatever 10 times, okay? We're gonna keep this simple, so we're just gonna count. And all of these tutorials, all these beginning tutorials regarding looping and iteration, we're just gonna count numbers. We could do other things, but this is just a starting point. And so it says stop before reaching the number 10. And this is really part of the thinking like a computer and how does a computer think? So I'm going to give you the answer up front because iterations or starting positions start at 0 and they don't start at 1. So that's why when we count 10 times, we're going to start the count at 0. And that's just because that's how the computer and the computer algorithms work. So we will count 0 through 9 instead of 1 through 10, just in terms of seeing it displayed to the screen. Okay. But in terms of teaching to your students, they need to know and understand that idea. Okay. Then what we'll do is we'll display instructions 1, 2, and 3 to the screen, 1, 2, and 3. Now, I do say we need to create a variable for starting the loop structure. And that's critical because without that, the loop doesn't loop. It doesn't know what to do because it's just simply going to count integers the next, the next, the next, the next. And we'll show you how that happens in code. And then, of course, all I want you to do is display each loop count to the screen. So let's take a look at what that means in pseudocode. So these are my display instructions. Repeat the loop 10 times and count by 1 and stop before 10. And then in the code on the back end, what the user of the code doesn't see is that we're having a starting point. And like I said, by default, the starting point for any counting structure is 0. So we are going to create a variable, we'll call it x this time, and just assign it 0, okay? Because that's where we want to start the count at. We just want to make sure that our learners, our young learners, are really understanding that element. And then we want to create a loop that repeats all the time. So we can create a loop or iteration that repeats forever, and we don't want to do that. We really want to be able to control how many times the computer does something, okay? So we're going to use what we call a while loop structure, and we'll get to that when we get into the code, but we only want to repeat the code 10 times. However, because we created this variable called x and we start at the point at 0, we only want to get it to the next number and then let the computer calculate that. So what we need to do is change the value of that variable. So what we will do is add 1 to that value. So it starts at 0, we add 1, it becomes 1. And then what happens is it goes back to the starting point, and that's why we have this arrow here in the flow chart. This will go and do its thing and then go back to the start of the iteration or the loop, okay? It will go back here, it will convert this to a 1 and go back down and go back down and go all the way through until the loop stops at the specified point. And for this to iterate through 10 times, we really need to understand what the count then in our head is 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Or when we write the code, we'll say while x is less than 10. So we did greater than and less than conditions, and we evaluated them as true or false in previous tutorials. So this is where that knowledge comes into play, meaning that while x is less than 10, when x is equal to 10, this is then is a false statement because x is 10, it's not less than 10, and that means when it reaches that condition, the loop will stop, okay? So things only execute in certain ways when the conditions are true. So we said if something is true, execute on a code. If it's not true, go to the next line, which is our else statement. And that was our beginning of understanding that if something is true, do something. While this is true, while x is less than 10, while this is true, then run the next line of code and run the next line of code. And then once the increment value is added, go back to the beginning of the loop. Okay, so this is how the pseudocode would look. This is how the flow structure would look. This is how the code would look. Let's take a look at how it executes. So I have repeat a loop 10 times, count by ones, and stop before reaching 10. And I always ask why, because we really want our students to understand what's happening behind the code. You know, what's the logic behind the code? So we are going to create a variable and we'll assign it the value of 0, and then we'll iterate through it. And then what we want to do is show that it's iterating through all of these times. Now there's not going to be any delay, just going to go boom, 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 boom. And then it will iterate, it will add 1 to the value, and then this will come back up here and change this value 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so forth. And then we'll see it run. Okay, so repeat a loop 10 times, count by ones, and stop before reaching 10. So here we go. Let's count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I feel like I'm on Sesame Street. Okay, cool. So it worked. It repeated 10 times. Our code worked. That's exactly how, that's as basic as it gets. So let's move on to the next challenge, and I'm going to continue to challenge you. I'll see you there.